When I first started working as a nanny, I never imagined I'd find myself in the situation I'm in now. I was hired to care for two wonderful children, and over the years, I became deeply attached to them. I was there for scraped knees, bedtime stories, and birthday parties. I knew their routines by heart, their favorite snacks, and the little things that would calm them when they were upset. It felt less like a job and more like being part of a family, at least. That's how I justified the closeness. Their parents seemed perfect together. The mom was kind, thoughtful, and incredibly trusting. She treated me with respect and often went out of her way to make sure I felt appreciated. The dad, on the other hand, had a certain charm about him. He was charismatic, warm, and had this presence that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just that he was physically attractive, though he definitely was. It was the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. He had this easy confidence that drew people in. At first, I ignored the way I felt around him. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things. A lingering glance when we crossed paths in the kitchen, a moment where our hands brushed when passing a dish, a slightly too long pause in conversation before one of us would snap back to reality. These moments felt insignificant on the surface, but they left me with this strange, unexplainable energy that I couldn't shake off. There were times when he'd come home from work trips, tired but still polite, and thank me for holding down the fort while he was away. His gratitude felt genuine, and it made me feel seen not just as the nanny, but as a person. I'd catch myself overthinking interactions, wondering if I'd misinterpreted a look or if I was just imagining the tension. I kept reminding myself that it was all in my head. After all, he was married. He had kids. And I was just the nanny. But even as I told myself those things, there was always something unspoken lingering between us. It was like a thin thread pulling us together no matter how hard I tried to avoid it. I'd hear his voice in the other room and feel my stomach tighten. I'd see his name pop up on my phone if he needed an update about the kids, and my heart would skip a beat. I started to feel guilty about it long before anything even happened because, deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. One evening, everything changed. The kids were asleep, their mom was away on a short trip, and he had just flown home from work. I'd made sure the house was calm, the kids were settled, and everything was in its place. I was sitting on the sofa, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, when he walked into the room. He looked exhausted but relieved to be home. He smiled at me, a smile that felt different somehow, and asked if I wanted a glass of wine. I hesitated for a moment but eventually said yes. I told myself it was just a friendly gesture, nothing more. We sat on the sofa together, glasses in hand, and started talking. At first, it was about the kids, their school projects, funny things they'd said recently, but then the conversation shifted. We started talking about life, about regrets, dreams, and the weight of responsibility. It felt personal. The air between us grew heavier with every passing moment. He was sitting closer now, his arm casually resting on the back of the sofa, his knee just inches from mine. I could feel the warmth radiating off him, and I hated how aware I was of every tiny detail. At one point, I looked over and caught him staring at me. He didn't look away. He didn't even try to hide it. Then, softly, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered against my skin, and my breath caught in my throat. He told me he wanted to kiss me. Just hearing those words sent a shockwave through my entire body. Every rational thought screamed at me to stop, to walk away, to remind him and myself that this was wrong. I told him it was a bad idea. I said it quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as I spoke the words, I didn't pull away. I didn't move. It was as if I was frozen in place, suspended between desire and guilt. And then he leaned in, and I let him. The kiss felt electric, like something I'd been holding my breath for without even realizing it. It wasn't rushed or careless, it was slow, deliberate, and full of unspoken emotion. I knew in that moment that there was no going back. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone. One thing led to another, and we ended up in a place I promised myself we'd never go. Every fleeting thought of guilt was drowned out by the overwhelming pull I felt towards him. In those moments, everything else faded away, the kids sleeping upstairs, his wife's trust, the reality of the situation. All that existed was us. Afterward, reality came crashing back down. I sat on the edge of my bed later that night, my head in my hands, trying to process what had just happened. I felt sick with guilt, but also overwhelmed by how intensely I felt drawn to him. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that felt impossible to explain. The next morning, I couldn't look him in the eye. I carried on with my day as if nothing had happened, tending to the kids, making breakfast, and trying to act normal. But every time our eyes met, the air felt charged again, like the night before had etched itself into the space between us. That night changed everything. It was the start of something I couldn't control, something I couldn't stop. And even though I knew it was wrong, even though every part of me wanted to take it back, I also couldn't deny how much I wanted it. It felt like we'd unlocked something that had been waiting to happen all along, and now that it had, there was no turning back. What started as one night quickly turned into a routine, a pattern that felt impossible to break. After that first time, it was like a dam had burst, and no matter how many times I told myself to stop, I couldn't. Every week after his flight landed, he'd come to me before going home. At first, I tried to justify it. I told myself it was just a phase, that it would fizzle out eventually, that the pull I felt towards him would fade with time. But it didn't. If anything, it only grew stronger. I would count down the days until his return, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. I'd replay our last encounter in my head, my heart racing with both anticipation and guilt. The hours before he arrived felt endless, and when he finally showed up at my door, it felt like time stopped altogether. There was something about those moments, stolen, secret, and fleeting, that made them feel more intense than anything I'd ever experienced before. He'd arrive with that same tired smile, his luggage still in hand, and for a moment it would feel like the rest of the world didn't exist. We didn't need words. The second the door closed behind him, it was like we were in our own little world, completely disconnected from reality. But reality always came rushing back afterward. When he left, I'd sit in the silence of my apartment, staring at the door he'd just walked out of, feeling empty and ashamed. I thought about his wife constantly. Every time I saw her, every time she texted me to check on the kids, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of what I was doing to her. She trusted me not just with her children, but with her home and her family. She saw me as part of their lives, and I was betraying her in the worst way imaginable. I wanted to stop. I told myself 1,000 times that I would. But every week, when his flight landed and he came to me, all my resolve would crumble. It wasn't just the physical side of things that kept me hooked. It was the way he looked at me, the way he listened when I spoke, the way he made me feel like I was truly seen. We had conversations that felt raw and honest, like we were sharing parts of ourselves that no one else got to see. He told me about his regrets, his dreams, and the parts of his life that felt heavy. And I told him about mine. In those moments, it felt like we were the only two people in the world who understood each other. But with every week that passed, the guilt grew heavier. I started to notice the little things that made it all feel more real. The way he'd check his phone while he was with me. The way he'd have to leave before it got too late. The way he'd kiss me goodbye, but never linger for too long. It was a constant reminder that no matter how strong our connection felt, it wasn't real. Not in the way I wanted it to be. I started to withdraw from the kids a little, even though I didn't mean to. I'd catch myself zoning out while they told me stories, my mind clouded with thoughts of him. I'd feel this sharp pang of guilt every time one of them hugged me or told me they loved me. They were innocent in all of this, and yet I was betraying them too by betraying their mother, by creating this tangled mess that they'd never understand if they found out. There were moments when I'd cry after he left, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. I'd stare at my reflection in the mirror and barely recognize the person looking back at me. I'd wonder how I let it get this far, how I let myself become someone capable of doing something so selfish, so cruel. But then, when the next week rolled around and he showed up at my door again, all of those thoughts would fade into the background. He had this way of making me forget about everything else when we were together. It was intoxicating, and it scared me how easily I let myself fall into it every single time. I started to feel like I was living two separate lives, the version of me who was the responsible nanny, the trusted caregiver, and then the version of me who was wrapped up in this messy, destructive affair. I knew it couldn't last forever. Every time he walked out my door, I wondered if it would be the last time. I'd brace myself for the day he'd tell me it was over, that he couldn't do this anymore, that the guilt was too much for him. But that day never came. Instead, we kept slipping further into this cycle, week after week, with no end in sight. There were times when I'd try to bring it up to ask him if he ever thought about stopping, if he felt as guilty as I did. But the words would get caught in my throat every time. It felt like if I said them out loud, it would shatter whatever fragile illusion we'd built around ourselves. So instead, I stayed silent. In some ways, I think I became addicted to the secrecy of it all. The stolen glances, the rushed goodbyes, the whispered conversations. It was like living in a story that I knew would never have a happy ending, but I couldn't bring myself to close the book. The guilt became a constant companion. It followed me everywhere when I was with the kids, when I was alone in my apartment, even in my dreams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my chest tight with anxiety, and wonder if today would be the day it all came crashing down. I started to fear being caught more than anything else, not just because of what it would do to me, but because of what it would do to his family. But despite all of it, the guilt, the fear, the shame, I still couldn't stop. Every week I'd open my door when he knocked, and every week I'd let myself fall back into the same pattern. It felt inevitable, like we were caught in a current too strong to swim against. And even though I knew we were heading towards something catastrophic, I couldn't bring myself to let go. I told myself that one day I would. One day I'd put an end to it, walk away, and leave it all behind. But deep down, I knew that day wasn't coming anytime soon. Not as long as he kept showing up at my door, and not as long as I kept letting him in. When I decided to leave the country, I thought it would be my way out, a clean break from the mess I'd gotten myself into. It felt like the only way to put an end to something I clearly couldn't stop on my own. I told myself that leaving would fix everything. The guilt, the secrecy, the constant fear of being caught, it would all fade away once I was gone. But things never play out as neatly as we hope they will. In the weeks leading up to my departure, I started preparing to leave my life behind. I sold my car, packed up my belongings, and gave notice on my home. Every step felt heavy, like I was dismantling not just my physical space, but the version of myself I'd been trying to hold together. But then came the offer from his wife, an offer that threw everything off balance again. She suggested I stay in their annex for my final weeks and borrow their spare car in exchange for doing airport pickups and drop-offs for her husband. The moment she said it, I felt a wave of panic crash over me. Staying there, living under the same roof as him, seeing him every day, pretending nothing was wrong, it felt impossible. But at the same time, how could I say no? Refusing would have seemed suspicious, especially after how close I'd become with their family. I tried to come up with excuses, reasons why it wouldn't work, but nothing felt convincing. So I talked to him about it. We both knew it was a terrible idea, but we also knew that saying no wasn't really an option. In the end, I agreed, and just like that, the final weeks before my departure became infinitely more complicated. Moving into their annex felt surreal. I'd been in their home countless times before, but now it felt different. Every glance, every shared space, every fleeting moment carried this unbearable weight. I felt like I was constantly on edge, waiting for something to slip, for someone to notice the way we looked at each other, the way we couldn't quite hide the tension that lingered in the air. The worst part was how natural it all felt. It didn't take long for us to fall into a routine. On the surface, everything appeared normal. I took care of the kids, chatted with their mom, helped around the house, but behind closed doors, it was anything but. There were moments when we'd find ourselves alone in the house, and the inevitable would happen. Sometimes it was quick, rushed, as if we were trying to steal back pieces of time that didn't belong to us. Other times it was slow, heavy with the knowledge of how wrong it was, but also how impossible it felt to stop. The drives to and from the airport became our moments of escape. Those car rides were some of the most emotionally intense moments I've ever experienced. In the confined space of the car, it felt like we could let our guard down at least a little. We'd talk about everything and nothing, our conversations deep and raw, sometimes bordering on confessions. There were moments of silence where the weight of what we were doing would settle over us, but then he'd reach over, touch my hand, and all the guilt would blur into the background again. Sometimes we'd pull over, Sometimes we wouldn't even make it to our destination before we found ourselves caught up in the same cycle. And every single time afterward, I'd sit in silence as he drove, staring out the window, trying to make sense of the mess I was tangled in. I knew I was betraying someone who had been nothing but kind to me. I knew I was risking everything, not just for myself, but for him, for his family, for the kids who trusted me. But no matter how many times I told myself I needed to stop, I couldn't. Living under the same roof as his wife was unbearable at times. She was so kind, so trusting, and it made me hate myself even more. She'd chat with me about her plans for the week, ask for advice about the kids, and thank me for everything I did for their family. There were moments when I'd look at her and feel physically sick with guilt. She deserved better, so much better than what I was doing to her. But the most confusing part of it all was how deeply I felt connected to him. It wasn't just about the physical side of things, it was something deeper. Something that felt almost spiritual in a way. I couldn't explain it and I couldn't ignore it. It felt like we understood each other in ways no one else could. There were moments when I'd catch him looking at me with this expression that felt so raw, so vulnerable, that it made my chest ache. And in those moments, I'd let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't entirely wrong. But then I'd hear the kids laughing in the other room or see his wife walk past, and reality would crash back down on me. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, balancing between two lives that couldn't possibly coexist. Every day felt like a cycle of longing, guilt, and self-loathing. I'd cry when I was alone, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But even through the tears, I knew I wasn't strong enough to walk away. The closer my departure date came, the more unbearable everything felt. There was an unspoken countdown hanging over us, and every shared glance, every secret touch, felt heavier because of it. I knew it was going to end, I knew I was leaving, but that didn't make it any easier. If anything, it made it worse. I started to wonder if he'd miss me when I was gone, if he'd think about me the way I knew I'd think about him. I wondered if the guilt would eventually fade for him, or if he'd carry it with him the same way I knew I would. Every day felt like a battle with myself. I wanted to stop, but I didn't want to let him go. I wanted to come clean, to confess everything, but I couldn't bear the thought of breaking his family apart. And most of all, I wanted to go back in time and undo it all, to stop myself from ever crossing that line in the first place. But it was too late for that now. The damage was already done, and all I could do was try to make it through those final weeks without completely falling apart. The final weeks living in their annex were some of the most emotionally draining days of my life. Every moment felt heavy with guilt, desire, and an overwhelming sense of dread. It was like walking a tightrope where every step felt more unstable than the last, and I was terrified that at any moment, everything would come crashing down. I was constantly on edge, hyper-aware of every glance, every word, every interaction. The weight of the secret we carried felt suffocating, and yet I couldn't stop. Every day was a strange mix of normalcy and chaos. I'd help with the children, prepare their meals, and laugh with them during playtime. On the surface, I looked like the same reliable nanny they'd always known. But underneath that facade, I was crumbling. The children's mother would chat with me over coffee, sharing stories about her week or venting about little frustrations. She was kind and trusting, and every interaction with her felt like a dagger to the chest. I couldn't look at her without feeling sick. But the worst moments were the ones when I was alone with him. There were times when his wife and the children were out, and it was just us in the house. Those stolen hours felt intoxicating and devastating all at once. Every touch, every kiss, every moment we spent wrapped up in each other was shadowed by guilt and the knowledge that it was all temporary. We both knew I was leaving soon, and it felt like we were clinging to every second we had left. The car rides to and from the airport became something I both dreaded and looked forward to. In the car, away from the house, it felt like we could be more honest, at least about our feelings, if not about the consequences of our actions. The conversations we had during those drives were some of the most intimate I've ever experienced. We'd talk about our fears, our regrets, and our hopes. There was an emotional vulnerability between us that felt raw and unfiltered. But those drives weren't always just about talking. Sometimes he'd pull over on a quiet road, and we'd get lost in each other again. Those moments felt desperate, like we were trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through our fingers. and every single time the guilt would come crashing down afterward. I'd stare out the window in silence, fighting back tears as he drove. The guilt wasn't just about what we were doing to his wife, it was also about the children. I'd grown to love and care for them deeply, and the thought of them finding out about what I'd done made me feel sick. They were innocent in all of this, and yet they were the ones who would be hurt the most if the truth ever came out. Every hug, every I love you from them felt like a reminder of how badly I was failing them. At night in the annex, I'd lie in bed and replay everything in my head. The stolen moments, the lingering touches, the way he'd look at me when no one else was around, it all felt so vivid, so consuming. But alongside those memories were the looks of trust from his wife, the sound of the children's laughter, and the crushing weight of knowing I was betraying them all. I'd cry silently into my pillow, trying to convince myself that it would all be over soon. That leaving would fix everything, but deep down I knew the damage had already been done. There were moments when I considered ending it before I left. I thought about telling him we needed to stop, that we couldn't keep doing this, but every time I tried to muster the courage, I'd see the way he looked at me, or he'd reach out to touch my hand and I'd crumble. I was addicted to the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world, the way he spoke to me with such sincerity and vulnerability. It felt impossible to let that go. But those final weeks also brought out some of the darkest emotions I've ever felt. Jealousy was one of them. I'd watch him interact with his wife, small gestures of affection, little moments of connection, and it would eat away at me. I hated myself for feeling that way, for wanting something that was never mine to begin with, but I couldn't help it. I felt this overwhelming desire to be the one he chose, the one he stayed with. At the same time, I was consumed by anxiety. Every conversation felt like it was teetering on the edge of discovery. I became hyper-aware of how I spoke, how I acted, how I moved around the house. I was terrified of slipping up, of saying or doing something that would expose the truth. The fear of being caught was constant, lurking in the back of my mind at every moment. Despite all of that, there were still moments that felt beautiful. Moments where it was just the two of us, where everything else faded away, and it felt like we were the only people in the world. Those moments were fleeting, but they were powerful. And they made it so much harder to let go. As the weeks passed and my departure date grew closer, I started to feel like I was unraveling. The weight of everything was becoming too much to carry. I wasn't sleeping well, I was losing my appetite, and I felt like I was constantly on the verge of breaking down. But I couldn't let anyone see that. I had to keep smiling, keep showing up for the kids, keep pretending like everything was fine. The day I was supposed to leave felt like it was looming over me, getting closer with every passing second. And yet, part of me didn't want it to come. Part of me wanted to stay, even though I knew it was impossible. The thought of walking away from him, from the connection we had, felt unbearable. But at the same time, I knew that staying would only make everything worse. In those final days, every interaction felt heavier, every glance lingered a little longer, every touch felt like it carried a goodbye. We didn't talk about what would happen after I left. We didn't talk about whether we'd stay in touch, or if this was the end. It felt like neither of us wanted to say the words out loud. When I look back on those weeks, it feels like a blur, a chaotic, emotional storm that I somehow managed to survive. But the scars it left behind are still there, and they still ache. And no matter how much time passes, I don't think I'll ever forget how it felt to live in that house, carrying a secret so heavy it felt like it was crushing me from the inside out. When the day finally came for me to leave, it felt like I was walking through a fog. The air was heavy, every breath sharp in my chest. My bags were packed, my ticket was ready, and yet I felt frozen in place. I had spent weeks imagining this moment, thinking about how I'd feel when it was finally time to walk away, but none of those imagined scenarios matched the reality. There was no relief, no clarity, only a suffocating mix of sadness, guilt, and confusion. The morning was quiet. I went through the motions of saying goodbye to the children, holding them a little longer than usual, memorizing their faces, their voices, their little quirks. They didn't understand the weight of my departure, and in some ways I was grateful for that. Their hugs were warm, their goodbyes cheerful. and it felt like they trusted I'd always be someone who had their best interests at heart. That trust felt like a knife twisting deeper into me. His wife hugged me too. She thanked me for everything, for my care, my patience, my time. Her words were genuine, her smile warm, and I could barely look her in the eyes. I felt like I was shrinking under the weight of her kindness. I wanted to tell her everything, to unburden myself from this secret that had consumed me, but I couldn't. The thought of breaking her heart, of shattering her world, of taking away the stability her family had, it stopped me. It felt selfish to unburden myself only to hand her an unbearable weight in return. He offered to drive me to the airport. It felt both right and excruciatingly wrong. The drive was silent at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. I stared out the window, trying to memorize the roads, the trees, the sky, trying to hold on to something familiar in the face of so much finality. Eventually he spoke. His voice was soft, heavy with unspoken words. He told me he'd miss me, that things wouldn't be the same without me around. I wanted to say something back, to tell him how much this hurt, how much I cared for him, but the words wouldn't come. We didn't pull over this time. There were no stolen moments, no desperate touches, no whispered confessions. It was just us, two people sitting side by side, knowing this was the end. When we reached the airport, he parked the car and turned to me. His eyes were glassy, his expression unreadable. He said goodbye, and it felt so final that I could barely breathe. I didn't look back as I walked away. Leaving the country should have felt like a fresh start, a clean slate. But it didn't. The guilt followed me, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. No matter how far I traveled, no matter how many new experiences I tried to throw myself into, I couldn't outrun the weight of what I'd done. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a dull ache that never fully went away. For months after I left, I'd wake up in the middle of the night with tears streaming down my face. I'd dream of the children, of their laughter, their hugs, their trust. I'd dream of her, the kindness in her voice, the warmth in her smile. And I'd dream of him. The way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me, the way I felt when I was with him. It felt like my subconscious was punishing me, refusing to let me forget even for a moment. I thought about reaching out to him so many times. I'd hover over my phone, typing out messages I'd never send. I wanted to know if he missed me, if he thought about me the way I thought about him. But I also knew that opening that door again would only make everything worse. There was no happy ending here, no resolution that wouldn't come at the cost of someone else's heartbreak. The guilt became a constant companion. It wasn't just about what I'd done, it was about who I'd become. I had betrayed someone who trusted me, someone who welcomed me into her home, who treated me like family. I had become someone I never thought I'd be, and I didn't know how to reconcile that with the version of myself I used to believe in. But the worst part was the uncertainty. I couldn't stop wondering if she deserved to know the truth. Would it be kinder to tell her, to give her the chance to make her own choices with all the facts in front of her, or would it only destroy her, unraveling her life and her family in ways that could never be repaired? I imagined myself in her position, and I knew I'd want to know. But at the same time, I couldn't bear the thought of being the one to deliver that devastation. The children's faces haunted me the most. They were innocent in all of this, yet they were the ones who would suffer the most if the truth came out. I had loved them deeply, cared for them like they were my own, and yet I had played a role in something that could tear their world apart. That thought sat heavy in my chest every single day. Time moved on, but the guilt didn't fade. It became quieter, less sharp around the edges, but it was always there, a quiet hum in the background of my life. I carried it with me everywhere I went, a reminder of the choices I'd made and the people I'd hurt. Looking back, I still don't have answers. I don't know if I did the right thing by leaving without telling her. I don't know if silence was kinder or if it was cowardly. I don't know if he ever thinks about me, or if he moved on without a second thought. But what I do know is that the weight of betrayal doesn't just disappear. It stays with you, woven into the fabric of who you are. And while I've tried to forgive myself, there's still a part of me that wonders if I'll ever truly be free from it. Sometimes I still think about reaching out to her. I wonder if she suspects anything, if she ever felt that something wasn't quite right. I wonder if she'd want to know, or if she'd rather keep her peace. But I always stop myself before I go too far down that road. Some truths I've realized can never be spoken without leaving a trail of destruction behind them. So I carry it with me. The memories, the guilt, the questions without answers. And maybe that's my punishment, to live with it, to hold it, and to never forget the cost of what I did.